The day began like any other for Scott, routine, predictable, and comforting. He wrapped up work earlier than expected, his mind filled with plans for a quiet evening with Amy. On his way home, he stopped by a florist and picked out a bouquet of lilies, their delicate white petals a nod to Amy's favorite flowers. There wasn't a special reason for the gesture, just one of those moments where he wanted to remind her she was loved. The January sky was overcast as he pulled into the driveway of their suburban home, a modest but cozy place they had spent years building together. As he stepped out of the car, a sense of anticipation buzzed faintly beneath his calm exterior. Maybe they'd share a bottle of wine tonight, he thought, or sit by the fireplace reminiscing about the vacations they'd been planning. But when Scott inserted the key into the lock and pushed open the door, something felt off. The air carried a faint scent of cologne, not his, but something sharper, unfamiliar, and intrusive. He paused in the entryway, sniffing the air instinctively. Maybe Amy had been testing a new fragrance, he reasoned, though the thought sat uneasily in his mind. He stepped into the living room, and the sight waiting for him hit like a sucker punch. The table was set with 2 wine glasses, each containing a generous pour of red. Candle stubs sat in a holder on the mantel, melted down as if they'd been burning for hours. His gaze flicked over the details. One of the glasses bore a smudge of lipstick, faint but unmistakable. Scott frowned, the back of his neck prickling. It didn't make sense. Amy didn't drink much wine these days, not since Scott had cut back himself. His eyes swept over the room again, catching the faintest signs of recent occupation, a man's leather jacket slung over the chair back, shoes too large to be hers placed haphazardly near the doorway. The pit in his stomach grew heavier. "Hey, babe. I'm home early," he called out, keeping his voice steady despite the knot of unease tightening in his chest. Silence. He strained his ears, listening for the shuffle of feet or the sound of Amy greeting him from upstairs. Instead, faint murmurs reached him, low, muffled voices, accompanied by the occasional, unmistakable sound of laughter. A man's laughter. Scott's heart began to hammer in his chest. His palms grew damp as he ascended the stairs, one deliberate step at a time. Each creak of the wooden staircase felt deafening, a steady drumbeat driving him toward a truth he wasn't sure he wanted to face. The voices became clearer as he neared the bedroom. A chill ran down his spine at the intimacy of the tone, the playful lilt of Amy's voice mingling with the deeper timbre of someone else's. His hand trembled as he reached for the door, nudging it open. The scene inside was both shocking and surreal, as if Scott had stepped into someone else's life. Amy sat on the bed, her laughter cut short as her gaze snapped toward him. Her hair was tousled, her shoulders bare save for the thin strap of a silk camisole that had fallen askew. Beside her, Ben, her co-worker, whom Scott had met during the last holiday party, scrambled to sit upright, his shirt unbuttoned and his face a mix of alarm and guilt. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Scott's vision narrowed, every detail in the room crystallizing, the sheets twisted around their legs, the flush on Amy's cheeks, the faint sheen of sweat on Ben's brow. Amy let out a startled shriek, clutching the covers to her chest as though that would undo what Scott had seen. "Scott," she gasped, her voice pitching high. "What are you doing here?" Ben, his face pale, stammered, It's not what it looks like, man. Not what it looks like." Scott thought bitterly. What a cliché. He stood frozen for a moment, 1,000 emotions surging through him at once, betrayal, humiliation, anger, grief. The bouquet of lilies dangled loosely in his hand, their soft petals brushing against his leg. He glanced down at them, a cruel symbol of the love he had carried home. Amy scrambled to explain, her words tumbling out in disjointed fragments. "Scott, listen, this isn't. I didn't mean for you to find out this way. It's..." Scott cut her off with a sharp glance, his mouth set in a hard line. "Save it." The room fell silent. Amy's lip trembled, but no further excuses came. Ben shifted uncomfortably on the bed, clearly waiting for Scott to explode, to scream, to lunge at him. But Scott did none of those things. Slowly, deliberately, he turned and walked back toward the door. He didn't slam it or shout, he didn't even look back. As he passed the dining room on his way out, he dropped the bouquet onto the table. The lilies landed askew, petals scattering across the polished wood. Scott stepped outside into the cool evening air, the door clicking shut behind him. The weight of what he had just witnessed began to settle on his shoulders. His hands trembled as he got into the car, gripping the steering wheel as though it was the only thing anchoring him to reality. The drive away from the house was a blur. His thoughts churned, each one cutting deeper than the last. This was supposed to be their home, their sanctuary. 6 years of marriage, memories, shared dreams, promises, reduced to ashes in the span of a single moment. He pulled over to the side of the road, unable to go any farther. Sitting there in the dim light of the dashboard, Scott let out a shaky breath. He closed his eyes, but the image of Amy and Ben burned behind his eyelids, a cruel reminder that his life had irrevocably changed. For the first time in years, Scott felt utterly, devastatingly alone. The days following that night stretched into a blur of sleepless hours and unanswered questions. Scott felt like a ghost in his own life, haunted by the scene he'd walked in on. Every detail played on an endless loop in his mind: Amy's flushed cheeks, Ben's panicked expression, the wine glasses, the betrayal. He couldn't shake the cold knot in his chest, the sense of being utterly blindsided. Amy had tried reaching out, of course. She sent text after text, left voicemails that vacillated between apologies and excuses. He ignored them all. His heart couldn't bear to hear her voice. On the third day, she showed up at the small hotel he'd checked into. Scott had told no one where he was, but Amy knew him too well. She found him at the edge of town, where he'd always gone to clear his head. He opened the door reluctantly, standing just inside the threshold. She looked a mess, her hair tied back haphazardly, her face devoid of makeup. It was a far cry from the polished, composed woman he knew. "Scott," she began, her voice trembling, "please, let's talk." "What's there to talk about?" he said flatly, crossing his arms. "It wasn't supposed to happen this way," she said, stepping closer. He raised an eyebrow. "So, there was a plan for this?" Amy flinched but pressed on. "I made a mistake. That's all it was. It didn't mean anything. You've been so distant lately, so wrapped up in work, Ben just." "I don't know," he listened. Scott's laugh was cold. "Oh, so this is my fault now?" Her eyes filled with tears. "That's not what I'm saying. But you have to admit, things haven't been the same between us. I've been feeling alone." The word stung, but Scott wasn't about to let her rewrite the narrative. "Alone?" he repeated. "You felt alone, so instead of talking to me, your husband, you found comfort in my absence with someone else? Is that how this works?" Amy's tears spilled over. "I didn't plan this. I swear, it just happened. I didn't mean to hurt you." "But you did," Scott said, his voice low and even. "And then you let me walk into it blind. You didn't even have the decency to tell me yourself." Amy sobbed openly now, but Scott felt no sympathy. The pain in his chest had numbed to a hard, bitter resolve. She reached for his hand, but he pulled away. "Scott, please, let's try to fix this. I don't want to lose you." He shook his head, stepping back. "You already have." Scott returned home the next day, not because he wanted to but because he needed to. He couldn't live out of a hotel indefinitely, and their house was as much his as it was hers. Amy was there, waiting in the kitchen when he walked in. "I want to work through this," she said, her tone firmer now, as if she'd rehearsed her speech. Scott didn't respond. He went to the fridge, poured himself a glass of water, and sat at the dining table. "I know you're angry," she continued, "but we have so much history, Scott. We can't just throw it all away. Couples go through rough patches, it's normal. He looked up at her, his jaw tight. A rough patch? That's what you're calling this? Amy exhaled sharply, clearly frustrated. You're blowing this out of proportion. I told you it didn't mean anything. Scott's knuckles whitened around the glass, but he kept his voice calm. You think I'm overreacting? You had an affair in our home, in our bed, and I'm the one being unreasonable. Scott, And don't tell me it didn't mean anything, he interrupted, his voice rising slightly. You don't destroy a marriage over nothing. She faltered, but then her expression hardened. I'm trying to make this right, but you're so wrapped up in your anger you can't even see that. Scott stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. Make it right, he said, incredulous. You don't even understand what you've done. You betrayed me, Amy. You lied to my face, and now you're gaslighting me into thinking I'm the problem. The word hung in the air, gaslighting. It struck a nerve, and for the first time, Amy's confident facade cracked. I'm not, Scott, that's not fair. I was lost. So was I, he said quietly, but I didn't cheat. It wasn't until a week later that Scott discovered the financial betrayal. He'd been sorting through their bank statements, something he usually left to Amy, when he noticed a series of suspicious transfers. Large sums of money had been withdrawn from their joint savings account and funneled into a separate account he didn't recognize. His heart sank as he pieced it together. The transfers coincided with the time she'd started her affair. She hadn't just cheated on him, she'd stolen from him, using the money they'd saved for vacations, renovations, and their future to bankroll her new life with Ben. Scott confronted her that evening, holding the printed bank statements in his hand. What's this? He demanded, slamming the papers onto the table. Amy barely glanced at them. It's not what you think. Don't you dare, he snapped. Don't lie to me again. This account, this money, it's yours, isn't it? For you and Ben. Amy sighed, rubbing her temples. Scott, I was just trying to make things easier. I didn't think you'd notice. You didn't think I'd notice, he interrupted, his voice rising. That's your defense? She crossed her arms, her tone defensive. You've been so focused on work. I had to take care of myself. You weren't there for me. Scott stared at her, the last shred of his patience unraveling. Do you even hear yourself? You think this is about me? About my shortcomings? Amy looked away, her silence damning. Scott exhaled sharply, stepping back. You've already taken enough from me, Amy. But this stops now. That night, Scott sat in his car in the driveway, staring at the house he had once considered a sanctuary. The betrayal ran deeper than he had imagined. This wasn't just about infidelity, it was about theft, manipulation, and a complete disregard for the life they had built together. As the anger simmered beneath his skin, Scott made a decision. He would no longer be the passive victim of her lies. She wanted to rewrite their story, to play the victim, but he wouldn't let her. Scott wasn't just going to leave. He was going to make sure she felt the full weight of what she had done. This wasn't revenge for revenge's sake, it was justice. Scott sat in his car, staring at the flickering neon sign of the diner where he'd arranged his first meeting with the private investigator. His coffee sat untouched on the table as he waited, the faint hum of a jukebox filling the silence. He wasn't acting out of anger, not anymore. His emotions had settled into something colder, resolve. The investigator, a sharp-eyed man in his 40s named Jack Sterling, slid into the booth across from him. Jack looked the part, with a weathered leather jacket and a no-nonsense demeanor. You're sure about this? Jack asked, pulling out a small notepad. Once we start digging, there's no turning back. I'm sure, Scott said firmly. I need to know everything. Not just the affair, there's something else going on. The money, her lies. I want the full picture. Jack nodded, scribbling notes. Okay. I'll need access to your financial records, shared devices, anything you think might help. This could take a few weeks. Scott slid a folder across the table. I've already compiled everything I could find. Bank statements, emails, even the ones she thinks I don't know about. Jack raised an eyebrow. You've done your homework. I'll get started right away. Scott leaned back in his seat, exhaling. This was the first real step toward reclaiming his life, and he intended to see it through. The weeks that followed were agonizing. Scott buried himself in work during the day and spent his nights poring over the evidence Jack sent his way. Each piece felt like another dagger to the heart: photos of Amy and Ben at a hotel, affectionate texts exchanged in the middle of the night, receipts for dinners and gifts purchased with their money. The financial records were worse. Amy had drained tens of thousands of dollars from their savings, enough to cover a down payment on a new house. She wasn't just cheating, she was planning an entirely new life, leaving Scott with nothing but the fallout. Jack's final report came in a thick manila envelope. Scott opened it with shaking hands, his stomach churning as he sifted through the documents. There it was, laid bare in black and white: Amy's betrayal, her lies, and her reckless disregard for the life they'd built together. One photo stood out: Amy and Ben smiling on the porch of a house that wasn't theirs. Jack had captioned it with the address. Scott stared at the image for a long time before dialing Jack's number. "You've done more than enough," Scott said when Jack picked up. "Now, it's my turn." Scott's next stop was a divorce lawyer. Sarah Maddox was a sharp, no-nonsense attorney with a reputation for being ruthless in the courtroom. Her office was sleek and modern, a far cry from the chaos Scott felt in his own life. As he laid out his situation, Sarah listened intently, her pen flying across a yellow legal pad. "You've got a strong case," she said when he finished. "Infidelity, financial misconduct, potential abandonment, it's all there. With the evidence you've gathered, we can push for full custody of your assets, including the house, and ensure she doesn't walk away with a dime." Scott nodded, his jaw tight. "And what about her job? Can this impact her professionally?" Sarah arched an eyebrow. "It depends. If the evidence shows she's used company resources or time to conduct the affair, or if her actions violate any moral clauses in her contract, it could be grounds for disciplinary action." "Why?" "I want her to face the consequences," Scott said, his voice cold. "All of them." Sarah leaned forward, her expression serious. "Be careful, Scott. I get it, you're angry, and you have every right to be. But if this starts looking like revenge instead of justice, it could backfire in court." "It's not revenge," Scott said, his tone steady. "It's the truth. I just want her lies exposed for what they are." Satisfied, Sarah began outlining the next steps. They would file for divorce immediately, presenting the evidence to the court and setting the stage for a settlement that left Amy with nothing. Scott also made a call to Amy's parents. He'd always been close to them, especially her father, Tom. It wasn't easy, but he felt they deserved to know the truth before things escalated. When he arrived at their house, Amy's mother, Linda, greeted him with a concerned expression. "Scott, is everything okay? You look tired." "Can I come in?" he asked. Tom joined them in the living room, and Scott wasted no time. He told them everything: Amy's affair, the stolen money, and her plans to start over with Ben. As he spoke, Linda's face crumpled with disbelief, while Tom's expression darkened with anger. "That doesn't sound like our Amy," Linda said weakly, tears streaming down her face. "Believe me, I wish it wasn't true," Scott replied. "But I have proof." He handed over copies of Jack's report, watching as Tom's hands trembled while flipping through the pages. When Tom finally looked up, his jaw was tight. "I can't believe she's done this. To you, to us. Linda sniffled. What are you going to do? Whatever it takes, Scott said firmly. I'm filing for divorce. I just wanted you to hear it from me before things get messy. The final piece of Scott's plan came together the night he confronted Amy. She was sitting on the couch when he walked in, her phone in hand. Scott, she said, looking up nervously. Can we talk? We'll talk, he said, tossing a folder onto the coffee table. Go ahead. Open it. Amy hesitated before reaching for the folder. As she flipped through the contents, her face went pale. Where did you get this? She demanded, her voice trembling. That doesn't matter, Scott said coldly. What matters is that I know everything. Scott, I can explain. No, he interrupted. You can't. You lied to me, Amy. Over and over. And now, you're going to face the consequences. Her expression turned defiant. What are you going to do? Ruin me? I don't have to, Scott said, standing. You did that yourself. He walked away, leaving her sitting in stunned silence. The wheels were in motion now, and there was no turning back. Scott's calm, calculated approach was paying off. The evidence was airtight, the legal groundwork laid. Amy's web of lies was unraveling, and Scott felt a sense of control he hadn't felt in months. But deep down, he knew this was just the beginning. The real battle was still ahead. The dining room was immaculate, lit with the warm glow of candles and a chandelier that Scott had polished to a near-mirror shine earlier that day. The table was set with their best china, plates they hadn't used in years. He'd spent hours preparing the meal himself, roasted chicken, creamy mashed potatoes, sautéed green beans, and a chocolate mousse for dessert. It all looked picture-perfect, down to the folded linen napkins at each place setting. This wasn't just dinner. It was theater, and Scott intended to play his part perfectly. When he had sent out the invitations, he'd been careful with his wording. He kept it vague, just enough to pique curiosity. Amy and I have something important to share, he'd written. We'd love for you to join us as we celebrate a special milestone. Amy's parents were the first to arrive, followed by her younger sister, Julie, and her husband. A few of their mutual friends trickled in shortly after, each exchanging hugs and pleasantries as they settled into the cozy atmosphere. Amy floated around the room, smiling brightly, though her furrowed brow hinted at confusion. What's going on, Scott? She whispered to him as he poured her a glass of wine. What's this all about? You'll see, he said with a small smile, his tone giving nothing away. As the final guest arrived, Scott clinked his glass, drawing everyone's attention. Thank you all for coming tonight, he began, his voice steady and composed. It means so much to have you here as we celebrate something significant. Amy's smile faltered as her eyes darted around the room. Scott, what are you doing? He ignored her, turning to the guests instead. Amy and I have been married for 6 years now, and it's been a journey, to say the least. Tonight, I wanted to reflect on that journey and share some things that have come to light. The room fell quiet, an air of anticipation settling over the group. Scott reached for a manila folder he'd placed on the sideboard, holding it up for everyone to see. I've prepared something special, he said, his voice calm but carrying an edge that made Amy stiffen. Scott, don't, Amy said, her voice low and urgent. He turned to her, his expression unreadable. Why not, Amy? It's just the truth. Without waiting for a response, he opened the folder and pulled out a stack of papers. Let's start with these, he said, holding up printed screenshots of text messages between Amy and Ben. He read aloud, his tone measured but biting. Can't wait to see you tonight. Scott's working late again, so we'll have the house to ourselves. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Or this one, Scott continued, flipping to another page. You're the only one who makes me feel alive. I can't stand pretending with him anymore. Stop it. Amy cried, standing up from her seat. Her face was pale, her hands shaking. "Scott, please." "Why, Amy? Is it embarrassing?" he shot back, his voice rising slightly. "You weren't embarrassed when you were doing it, were you?" Amy's father, Tom, leaned forward, his face red with anger. "What is this, Scott? What's going on?" Scott turned to him, his gaze steady. "Tom, I didn't want to believe it either, but your daughter's been having an affair. 4 months. With a man I trusted." He gestured to the texts. "This is just part of it." Tom's face darkened as he looked at Amy. "Is this true?" "Dad, Amy stammered, but Scott cut her off. "There's more," he said, pulling out bank statements. "While she was sneaking around with Ben, she was also draining our savings. Tens of thousands of dollars gone, money we'd set aside for our future, for renovations, vacations, and emergencies." He handed the documents to Tom, who scanned them with shaking hands. "You used the money?" Tom growled, his voice low and dangerous. "I was going to replace it." Amy cried, her voice cracking. "I just needed." "What, Amy? A head start on your new life with him?" Scott interjected. Linda, Amy's mother, was crying softly, her face buried in her hands. Julie sat frozen, her wide eyes darting between her sister and Scott. The room buzzed with whispered shock as Scott pressed on, his voice steady. "I gave her everything," he said, looking around the room. "I worked late nights to support us, trusted her with our finances, and this is what she did. She betrayed me in every way possible." Amy's friends exchanged awkward glances, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. No one knew what to say. "I invited you all here tonight because I thought you deserved to know the truth," Scott said, addressing the group. "This isn't about revenge. It's about accountability. Amy made her choices, and now she has to face them." Amy sank back into her chair, her head in her hands. "You've humiliated me," she whispered. "You humiliated yourself," Scott replied coldly. Tom stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I can't believe this," he muttered, throwing the bank statements onto the table. "Amy, how could you do this to him? To us? Dad, please, But he was already walking toward the door. Linda followed, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. One by one, the guests began to leave, murmuring their goodbyes and avoiding eye contact with Amy. Julie lingered for a moment, placing a hand on Scott's arm. "I'm so sorry," she said softly, before turning to follow her parents out. The room was silent when the door closed behind the last guest. Amy sat slumped in her chair, her face streaked with tears. "You ruined my life," she said bitterly. Scott stared at her, his expression unreadable. "No, Amy. You did that all on your own." He turned and walked out of the dining room, leaving her alone with the wreckage she had created. The courthouse was a somber, imposing building, its gray facade matching Scott's mood as he strode through its heavy doors. In his hand was the folder of evidence he had painstakingly compiled, text messages, financial records, and photos. This was the culmination of weeks of preparation. Scott had walked into this battle armed, and he intended to walk out victorious. His lawyer, Sarah Maddox, met him at the courtroom entrance. "You've got this," she said, her sharp eyes radiating confidence. "The evidence speaks for itself. Just keep calm and let me do the talking." Scott nodded, his jaw tight. He glanced at the other side of the courtroom, where Amy sat with her lawyer. Her face was pale, her usual poise replaced by a visible tension. She wouldn't meet his eyes, focusing instead on the stack of papers in front of her attorney. The judge entered, and the proceedings began. Sarah wasted no time laying out their case. She began with Amy's infidelity, presenting the text messages and photos as evidence. Scott felt a wave of satisfaction as the judge frowned, flipping through the damning messages. The plaintiff's wife engaged in an ongoing affair, Sarah said firmly, her voice cutting through the room. This was not a fleeting mistake, but a calculated betrayal spanning months, during which she used marital assets to fund her relationship with another man. Amy's lawyer tried to counter, painting Scott as distant and overly focused on his work, but Sarah was prepared. Even if Mr. Taylor worked long hours, that does not justify deceit or theft, she argued. If the defendant was unhappy, she had options: counseling, separation, but instead, she chose to siphon funds and betray the marriage. Next came the financial records. Sarah presented the bank statements, highlighting the tens of thousands Amy had transferred to a personal account. This money was meant for the family's future, she emphasized. The defendant's actions have left my client in financial turmoil, forcing him to bear the burden of rebuilding while she enjoyed a lavish lifestyle. Amy shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her face flushed with embarrassment. The judge's gaze turned steely as Sarah continued. When it was Amy's turn to testify, she stumbled over her words, her once confident demeanor replaced by nervousness. "I wasn't trying to hurt anyone," she said weakly. I felt alone." Sarah's cross-examination was brutal but fair. "You felt alone, so you drained your husband's savings. You funneled money into a private account and used it to fund trips and gifts for your lover. Is that correct?" Amy's silence spoke louder than words. Scott sat quietly, watching as the truth unraveled. He had expected to feel triumphant, but instead, there was only a hollow sense of relief. This wasn't just about winning, it was about closure. Meanwhile, Scott had taken steps to ensure Ben faced consequences as well. He sent the photos and text messages to Ben's employer, an upscale marketing firm with a strict code of conduct. Within days, Ben was called into a meeting with HR. The fallout was swift. His actions violated company policy, and he was terminated. News of the affair spread quickly among their colleagues, leaving Ben humiliated and jobless. His arrogance, which had once infuriated Scott, was now replaced by desperation. After hours of deliberation, the judge delivered the ruling. The room fell silent as the judge looked directly at Amy. "This court finds the defendant, Amy Taylor, guilty of infidelity and financial misconduct," he said. Given the overwhelming evidence, the plaintiff, Scott Taylor, is awarded sole ownership of the marital home and all remaining joint assets. Scott's breath caught as the judge continued. Furthermore, the defendant is ordered to repay the misappropriated funds in full. Given the nature of her actions, this court denies any request for spousal support. Amy's lawyer looked defeated, while Amy herself appeared shell-shocked, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the table. Scott exhaled slowly, a weight lifting from his shoulders. It wasn't just a victory, it was vindication. Outside the courthouse, Scott was met by a few close friends who had supported him throughout the ordeal. Tom and Linda, Amy's parents, were there as well. Tom approached Scott, his face lined with regret. "I'm sorry for what she did to you," Tom said, his voice heavy. "You didn't deserve any of this." "Thank you," Scott replied. "That means a lot." Linda hugged him tightly, her tears dampening his shirt. "Take care of yourself, Scott," she said. "You're a good man." As they walked away, Scott felt a twinge of sadness. Amy's choices had torn apart not just their marriage but her family as well. Scott returned to the house, their house, now solely his. It felt different without Amy's presence, but it also felt like a blank canvas. Over the next few weeks, he began to rebuild. He repainted the walls, rearranged the furniture, and removed every trace of the life they had shared. It was cathartic, a process of reclaiming not just the space but himself. He focused on work, reconnected with old friends, and even joined a local hiking group to fill his weekends. Slowly, the wounds began to heal. One day, as he stood in the backyard watching the sunset, he realized something. For the first time in months, he felt at peace. The betrayal no longer defined him. It was part of his past, but it didn't control his future.